Welcome to the Journal of the Southwest Radio podcast, a production of the University of Arizona Southwest Center in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. I'm Taylor Miller, a researcher with the Southwest Center. Today, I'm overjoyed to chat with Gabriel Dozal. Gabriel is a writer and educator from El Paso, Texas. He received his MFA in creative writing from the University of Arizona, and he's a poetry editor for Diagram. His work appears in Poetry Magazine, the Iowa Review, Guernica, Brooklyn Rail, the Literary Review, the Volta, and elsewhere. Gabriel, hello. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Taylor. I'm happy to speak to you.
So much fun. And thank you for your time. So, yeah, I just really can't explain my excitement enough. The opportunity here to learn more about your writing process and specifically your brand new book, The Border Simulator, which is out this August. I first learned of your writing while teaching political geography here at U of A. And it was a course that centered on borders as in everywhere, from the Mediterranean basin to occupied Palestine to the region that you and I both call home, as well as the myriad iterations of borders and bordering that are reproduced and bolstered by virtual walls, by biometrics and surveillance. And so I found your way to 8, a poem from the Border Simulator, which was featured in the Brooklyn Rail. My students in that class, we read it, we discussed the work, and I've just been waiting with bated breath since the book release. So this is really, really fun. But before we get into some of the nuance of that project, I'm hoping here that you'd be open to sharing a bit about your background and, rather what brought you to poetry and writing about these highly conflictual sites and spaces of the U.S. Mexico borderlands.
Yeah, I mean, I'm honored that your class took a look at my poems. I would have loved to have been like a fly on the wall and heard the conversations, but
next time for sure.
Yeah,
Next time.
okay, yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah, but to your question, it's sort of in my blood and something I can't escape. I'm from El Paso. All my family is from either El Paso or Juarez, and I grew up sort of like a fish in water, only knowing the border and its particular rhythms of life and what it's like to live between two cultures. I mean, early on, I never wanted to write about the border because it seemed like the most obvious and easy thing to write about in my experience, or it's something I knew so well. It almost seemed like I should be writing about something else, at least when I was younger. But as I've kind of grown a little older and a little wiser, I feel more comfortable writing about being from the border. I also think it's a little bit of an expectation, I think, or it's like a pressure or something I feel like people expect me to write about the border. And in my own small way, I kind of poke fun at this in the book while still playing into this role as well of a border person writing about the border. But I feel like I've wanted it to be my own kind of unique look at the border. But as far as poetry goes, like why I chose poetry, I mean, language has always been the art form I express myself best in. My father was a middle school art teacher for 30 years, and he's a Southwest landscape painter. These are kind of like the skills he passed down to me, right? He had this great knowledge of art, these teaching skills. I can't draw or paint outside of a paper bag, but I think language is where I'm able to pull that kind of energy and instinct to be creative, but also kind of like a work ethic, which I get from my mom as well. Like it's kind of things passed down from my parents, kind of funnel themselves into poetry.
That's so beautiful. As a newer-ish mom, that kind of makes me tear up because I'm always thinking about, how artwork and art making and the books that we surround ourselves with in the house, how that is imprinting on my daughter, hopefully for the best. And, that sounds really nice. And I have to take a look at your dad's artwork too. That's phenomenal. So something that fascinates me, and albeit it's a tiny bit tangential here, but maybe not, but here is in the time that's leading up to reading The Border Simulator, and now in planning for our chat here, I'm Googling like, what is the Border Simulator, just to sort of get a baseline understanding of what the world sees and thinks of it as the phrase even, and just to see how that concept could be cobbled together. And prior to some of the press for your book that's now starting to fill up, searches and circuits, there were quite a few YouTube videos that were popping up, and ones that were like Mexico Border Simulator and, Border Patrol Police Simulator. And basically they're reviews and demonstrations for all these different video games. No shortage of them there. And so there's like these screen grabs for a slew of them that feature iterations of a very, sort of tested theme of a man, brawny, white as snow, in a flak jacket or a bulletproof vest, or, some iteration of full combat gear, sometimes camo, sometimes not. And then, of course, there's police in large letters across their chests and backs. But from what I noticed, and again, this isn't like a deep dive media studies thing here, but there's no flag, there's no nation state branding otherwise. And so the border then is like a nowhere, but it's a border as an everywhere. And so it's, of course, we all know nothing new that, military and combat simulation games are going hand in hand with this lethally toxic, heteropatriarchal, white supremacist ideology so prevalent. These ways of believing and being in the world. And, I'm thinking, I'm not in the gaming world, but it's still, to me at least, it's very shocking to be confronted here in 2023 with this blatantly racist typology, these stereotypes. And one vignette in particular, then, it really stuck with me. And I'm actually considering doing that deeper dive on all of this, but it came up about a TikTok search on Google, and the screenshot was titled "How to Cross the Border in Mexican Border Sim Backrooms." And the scene could, presumably then be any point of entry along the U.S. Mexico border. The details somewhat obscured, a little bit pixelated, but as if that matters to anybody. And beyond the several layers of fencing and a speed limit sign that was in English and in miles, there's lights and there's awnings of the checkpoint. And then there's a small figure, pretty much like a Lego figurine, in black jeans, a shrunken black t-shirt, and a sombrero. And so first of all, what the hell? And secondly, to fight back against the nausea-inducing rage of all of this, at least on my end, these crass and ignorant tropes. And so, very long-winded there, but I want to think about simulation then, the simulation, if we will. Maybe something like these, maybe not. But can you talk to us a bit about the border simulator as a place and as a process and as this sort of repetition or these cycles?
Yeah, I think in a lot of places, the book deals with what you're speaking about, this online kind of representation of the border in a lot of different ways, not just the kind of like Roblox pixelated, these games. Because I did similar kinds of research, right? Just kind of Googling border simulator and what that comes up with, right? But for myself, it started off as just as an idea I wrote in a poem once, just kind of like a practice kind of thing. And Ander Monson, who at the time was the head of the creative writing department at the University of Arizona, he saw that phrase, he circled it and said, "That's an interesting idea and concept." I mean, so after that, like I said, I did something similar to you. I started Googling and searching for iterations of something like a border simulator. There's an early computer game made by some, I guess, like engineers, I think, at the University of Texas at El Paso, that also moved in these kind of stereotypes, this sort of like Lego Roblox version, these like, like little 16-bit cactuses and stuff. Almost like Frogger, if you know that game Frogger.
Absolutely.
That kind of like, but placed in the desert.
Right.
There's other iterations like those are sort of kind of like lowbrow, but that director, Iñárritu, he's won an Oscar for Best Director, but he created this thing called Carne y Arena. It's a virtual reality simulation that it is much more of an art piece, like an immersive art piece. So I definitely wasn't the first border simulator, or the first one to kind of think of this, right? And I'm sure there'll be other future iterations and examples. And I think it's a powerful metaphor that can stand in for all kinds of personal causes, political, cultural, and literal types of crossing. That I think there's room for many border simulators.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
I think, and this idea exists, like the border simulator. It is sort of this big, broad idea within the book, and I think I do that so that hopefully readers can read into that broadness, their
Mm,
own type of simulation. But it exists. It exists in many different ways within the book. I think that's what it is, like this morphing and this changing.
right.
And each poem or each set of poems kind of describes the border simulator in a different way. Like for instance, the poem that ends the book, "You've always been a border simulator."
Mm,
That's a little joke to myself, almost like as if me, my person, is an
mm,
example of this type of border simulation. Just me walking around in the world and meeting people.
right.
I'm like an idea of what it's like to be from the border, just because I'm from there. But I'm hoping readers can see this border simulator from many different angles, many different possible narratives and stories.
Yeah. Well, and my brain jumps around to so many different locales, so many different everywhere borders throughout the world.
Yeah,
I'm thinking of everything from drone surveillance and the virtual wall, which I mentioned before, which is ever growing and booming as a business and as a place and as a time too. And I'm also thinking of like these new their Elbit systems launched these new like suicide drones, they're calling them, but suicide is a little confusing to me, but anyways, and how they're field tested here in the U.S. borderlands, and then those
right,
technologies are exported across the world in a very borderless way, right? The sort of
right,
the
right.
financialization
Yeah,
of the border as an everywhere, but then of course there's that
right,
very sort of site specific ways in which the technologies are tested. And I kind of just fixate on the material, but of course there's all sorts of iterations of this.
right. But Taylor, in a lot of ways, just because I know what you teach and how you're involved with the Southwest Center, you're in a lot of ways you're an ideal reader
Mm-hmm.
for the book, because you're so close to it, because you're aware of all of these things. Um, I mean, my book speaks to that type of surveillance, that type of technology that exists at the border, and it tries to play with it. It tries to like blow that up. It tries to
Yeah.
use that language
Mm,
of the border, and like that phenomenon that you just spoke of. In the
yeah.
book, it's jeans, it's clothes that get to cross borders without any. The jeans don't need papers. The jeans don't need documents.
Yeah.
The goods move freely past
Mm-hmm.
borders, but the
Mm-hmm.
character Primitivo, they're stuck there. They can make the jeans, they can make the goods, and the goods get to
Mm-hmm.
pass, but they don't. So
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
wonderful.
So yeah, speaking to that movement and the freedom of or lack thereof, one of the very most poignant aspects of this book is the Spanish translation, which was done by Natasha Tiniacos. The book is arranged, and I'm sure there's a lot of terminology or so much effort that goes into this crafting. But just as sort of a novice on my end, I find it arranged in such a way that English, it's on the left-hand side of the page and then the Spanish is on the right, but it's a line-by-line translation opposed to, say a full poem in the English language and then followed by a full poem in Spanish or, myriad other languages. And so maybe there's terminology for that. But what's so striking to me, again, granted, somebody with a very, very elemental grasp of Spanish, as well as, the craft of poetry and prose, but it's how one's eyes can just toggle back and forth on the page. And it's between words, it's between languages, it's between homelands and words and worlds. And so it's this boundary, it's this border, but it's the spine of the book. And the reader is free. In my eyes, literally in my eyes, but in my eyes, a real freedom of movement, perchance, where you can dance between these sides, or rather, there are no sides here. And so to me, I feel brilliantly allegorical of the borderlands. Because of the closures and the openings and the waiting 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 and the breeding, the wrapping and breeding, bleeding and the living between the so-called sides. And I know that this is an intense labor. Translation is an intense
Right.
labor. And so perhaps you can share a bit about this process, for you and for Natasha, and what all of that was like.
Yeah, and thank you so much for the kind words and the brilliant kind of reading of that way it works. And I believe it was told to me that it's called when the poems are facing each other in one language and the other. I believe it's en face. En face. It's
Oh,
like a French
yeah,
word.
yeah.
I hope I don't have that wrong. I think, but it's like, but then we refer to it as just facing, like
Sure.
facing translations.
Right.
I know Natasha will be very happy to hear your wonderful reading. So
Mm,
the idea of the translation came from my editor at One World, Nicole Counts. She suggested it. She suggested a translation into the Spanish, and it was not something I was expecting or even
mm,
imagining for the book. But once she suggested that, I pretty quickly came to the realization, sort of like to what you had in your question, that if we're able to have the poems facing each other, the possible metaphors for the reader
mm,
and the crossing, and like you're saying, the spine of the book being like a border that connects the world but separates them at the same time. There's just there's the amount of depth that can give the book is very exciting.
mhm,
So I was, and for for a moment we weren't sure if we were going to be able to do that,
mm,
because it was either like that or the first half of the book would be in English and then the second half would be in Spanish. But I really wanted it
right.
to be facing, because just like you've picked up on, that those brilliant, those amazing metaphors, you can move back between languages. So when it came to the process though of
Yeah.
translating, Natasha Tiniacos graciously agreed to do the translation in a limited time. She had maybe about 4 months
Wow.
to finish the translation. And one thing I wanted early on was I wanted to give Natasha as much freedom in the Spanish to translate it
Mm,
however she saw fit. And I gave her as much liberty as possible to run with or make up metaphors,
mm,
to make up her own kind of like parallels in the Spanish, and for two reasons. One, this was a necessity; it was necessary. As you know, in the English, there's many jokes and puns and language play
mhm,
that
mhm,
that is impossible to translate into the
right,
Spanish, because that
right.
metaphor doesn't exist, or the English language play is different.
Mhm,
So Natasha had to find parallels in the Spanish and kind of come up with her own kind of version of things. Secondly, I wanted the Spanish translation to push even a bit further, and to even at times have its own outlook or its own modes, its own way of thought through the language,
mm,
through the poems. And if you look carefully, we didn't get to do it as much as I would like, but there's certain sections where the Spanish has its own special metaphor or its special
mm,
meaning or its own play. And because there's this Spanish version of the poems, okay, sorry, excuse me, sometimes because there's Spanish in
mm,
my English poems, right? In the English, sometimes
mhm,
I code switch into English or Spanglish, right? So sometimes
sure.
that stays in the Spanish, it stays in Spanish, or sometimes the English is just represented in the Spanish. There's a few parts where Natasha decided, you know what, the only way to get this, Celine Dion pun is to have the Celine Dion lyrics because it's not going to work in the Spanish. So we kept a few
Yeah.
things in the English. There was times during the process where the Spanish influenced the Spanish edited a little bit of the English sometimes, because
Okay. Yeah.
they're kind of like updated versions. So,
Right.
anyways, the translation has its own mind and its own rules at times, and this also is
Mm.
just very exciting and very special for me and Natasha, and we're both really proud of what we've done here.
Yeah, it's so fabulous. And just laden in everything that you just said is exactly, to me at least, what these borderlands are, the code switching and how you have to move through certain spaces or not. And I'm sure that there's a whole lot that I'm missing out on, not being able to read the Spanish side of things here, but definitely it's fun to sort of like pick out words depending on like what sort of translation I'm looking for. And I'm like, oh, I'll add that to the personal dictionary. Okay.
Oh man, yeah. Let me tell you, I mean, my Spanish is not great. Like I speak like kitchen Spanish, right? Like I
Yeah.
grew up, working in kitchens, and it's okay.
Mm.
But even me being from the border, it's not really great. But getting to read my poems in Spanish is just the coolest thing ever. It's I think they're better poems in Spanish. They sound better in Spanish than they do in
Cool.
English.
Wow.
There's more musicality. It's just a fascinating, exciting thing.
Ah, that's so beautiful. Maybe there would be like a joint reading or something like that one day. That would be really, really cool with you and
Yeah.
Natasha.
Yeah.
That's so great. So, obviously border, something on my mind here so much lately. These border studies conferences, where academics, there were once again, I say we, but they, once again, jetting across the globe, right? This illustrious global citizen, a lot of people wear as a badge of honor. But, this chance to, yet again, if we want to call it a post-pandemic world, talking about borders and making posters about borders and joining panels about borders and writing journal papers about borders, all while coasting past and over these borders. And so, we're back in this imagined sort of post-pandemic full swing, if you will. And what I keep coming back to and kind of haunting in a sense as I, kind of fiddle my way through this whole world of academia is like, would there still be borders if we ceased theorizing about them? And I pose this question, like sometimes flippantly to friends, but, it's just like sort of the circles that I'm in and moving through or pretending to be part of, that it's just so much is focused on, predicated on the study of borders. And I think like at some point, there's got to be a rupture here. There has to be a rupture. This is not a sustainable practice, right? And so I suppose the obvious answer is yes, of course, the borders still be few academics dipped out, but they're not necessarily like upholding on their own, nor funding the Department of Homeland Security or Frontex or the Canada Border Services and all the other iterations of these agencies. But every single day I open my inbox and, it's full of calls for papers and calls for jurors and, about historicizing and, dare I say, romanticizing these border crossings and the border crossers and the materialities of these borders, here in the Sonoran Desert and throughout the world. And, you write, at this point on the map, all the world's a border. And I can't tell you how many times I underlined that, but I and it's probably going to be something I dwell on for the rest of my life. But I'm wondering then, like, what all of that effort and that labor and that money could and would look like if it was instead translated into more direct action against the reproduction of these borders. And as I ramble on, but your text to me, it's one such direct action, I really believe, because while writing or, the act of other forms of art making is sometimes labeled as more nonviolent protest or, perhaps not in of itself a blockade or a chaining to a bulldozer or a detention camp fence. I read this work. I sat with this work. At first I read it all in like a couple hours, but then I'm like, okay, slow down, revisit, meditate on it, but I read it as a very active refusal of the cliches surrounding migration and of these border towns and of the checkpoints. It's to me, it's a simultaneous scar and a healing. And it's this laying bare of so many of the hypocrisies of the agencies and of these war hawks as politicians. And I read it as a future of these presently extremely precarious landscapes because I, perhaps like you and other listeners here, we don't believe, or I don't believe that this, what feels permanent is for us to presume as so, and at least not without demanding its dismantling. And so you say the border is a tactic and a symptom. It accuses you of committing the crime it's committing, you of landing what it's lording. There's a border and then there's a hidden border, one I can only access through the murmurs. And so I suppose then I'm curious, we're speaking at a time when Title 42 has just ended, but, there's this huge revamping of the virtual wall and scaling up of all these technologies and so on and so forth. And the Biden administration is just, going full force with sending missiles across to Ukraine to defend other borders. And,
Right.
And then
Right.
we have governors like Greg Abbott in Texas, all throughout the Southwest and in Florida too. And, the agency heads, and we have Raytheon and Elbit and Leonardo executives and these paramilitaries and the vigilantes. And, I'm writing and the commas and the commas. And it's just like all these iterations and layers of these borders. But it's like, where can we, or where do you, I suppose, more specifically, envision this going, this as a border simulator? But, how can these lines and walls continue to contort the region? Or, like, are we stuck in the simulation, I guess, is my, comment as a question.
But again, Taylor, thank you so much for the kind words and the wonderful reading of the book. Like it means so much to me that you connected with the book in such a way that you've caught a lot of my reason for chasing these ideas. But at the same time, I've snuck so much of myself and my own beliefs into these things, or just things I love. So even that one of the quotes that you pulled, like, at this point, all the world's a border, like that's that's a riff off of a Shakespeare line, right? Like all the world's a stage.
Oh, okay.
So there's all these like little, so it brings me so much joy for you to find and bring out these quotes. Here's something that just your question brings up immediately as that question, like is this a simulation? Are we living in a simulation? What is this? I wrote a poem that didn't get to make it into the book, but about the practice of, I think it was Governor Abbott and also DeSantis, right? They would bus an airplane migrants to like Martha's Vineyard and other places. This
Chicago,
right. This absolutely just using the crossers as a political football that just is so insane, so wild, strange. It's like the poem writes itself at that point. Like it's like I can't, like, a lot of this is half based in reality, half based in a type of stereotype or like a fakery, a simulation, right? But that a situation like that, I can't even make up something as good as that, right? Like
I know.
There's so many, like, I try to, as you noted, cook up or bring to the surface the absurdity of what it's like to cross a border. And this absurd event happens. I can't even make, like, I'm trying to make these like blown up, ridiculous, funny and dark things, and something happens in reality. So this question,
and it's doubly absurd than anything that we could think of, right? It's just like we could create and I'm sure maybe somebody's out there doing this already, but we could like create the poems just by pulling those headlines. It's like they're just so grotesque and hyper real,
right?
That you almost can't wrap your head around. I read the other day, and I'm going so tangential here, but Governor Abbott's now outlawing water breaks in Texas. And I'm just thinking, as a longtime Sonoran desert dweller, and we're both sort of like preying on monsoons here, 4 monsoons, and just thinking about going back to that whole notion of water being life, and it's just like just stripping life down to absolute nothing. But I don't even know you can tie that all into simulation. It's just so grotesquely harmful and disgusting, but I don't know.
Yeah, so this is a good chance for me to talk about sort of the style of the book as well, and I'll get back to your question here in a moment. But my favorite author, she won the Nobel Prize in 2004 for literature, Elfriede Jelinek. She's an Austrian writer. Her mode is this darkly funny, very absurd, but very lyrical, very poetic writing. And she doesn't really write poetry. She writes plays and she writes novels, but it feels very much like poetry. And she writes about Austria's Nazi past, mostly. I mean, she writes about a lot of subjects now, but she kind of brings to the surface this dark past in a very funny, but also very dark way. And this influenced the book because this is a part of the border that I want to, I guess I can't think of a better metaphor than bring to the surface here, but to show in the book, because even though all of this types of violence and absurdities happen at the border, I'm from there, and it's also a hilarious, joyful, full of life kind of place,
Absolutely.
right? So
Yeah.
and I don't want, I mean, part of the simulation is like, the difference between what we experience in real life and what we experience on screens, right? We
Mm.
live two lives. We live our life through screens and through social media. It's just the way the world is. We get so much of
Yeah.
the world through there. We
Right.
even younger people now, they're formative. They have formative events happen online through screens,
Hmm.
right? Like, and
Hmm.
then we have our the real life, and they both those things don't always match up,
Right.
the way that we know, right? So part of that simulation is, you know following media and news, you tend to hear only about the darker things that are happening at the border, which I'm glad that that's part of media. People need to know about this too. But in the book, I'm also trying to bring together this friction by also having this kind of gallows humor, by having this kind of like language play, this word play between two
Mm.
languages, to show hopefully this fuller experience
Hmm.
of the border. Now, I guess, the border, it's hard to predict. It's hard to know. Even me, who I'm from there, I know
Hmm.
how customs and border patrol works. I have friends and family who work for customs because it's a
It,
well-paying job that you don't need a
right.
college degree for. It's it's the best job pay-wise that you can get in El Paso without a college degree. It's
Right.
So many of my friends, many of my family, they are, kind of painted into a corner there, and they're perfect fit. They're the perfect fit for the job because they speak English and Spanish, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's
Yeah.
irony. But it's hard to know even then how the border works because it's thousands of cogs moving together. And, I feel like I don't necessarily have an answer to the tougher questions about how borders are resolved, how this violence and darkness are resolved. But like I said, I wanted to present this absurdity and the friction of these borders while not forgetting that verve and the jokes and the puns in English and Spanish. So many of the poems in the book are in the voice of a customs agent or
Hmm.
something
Hmm.
similar speaking to Primitivo or Primitiva. And I wanted this darkness and this friction in the book because I think that's the best way I can present the world that I know is with this type of friction.
That's so beautiful. And it's so important to constantly remember that too, to still find ways to center the joy and the ways in which life is continuing on despite all the hardship. Because I actually, I fall very privy to that trap too, on social media or otherwise, just in very aggressively political, one-sided conversations on my end at Trader Joe's. I'm like, we need to do this. And the bagger's like, whoa, okay. But,
But I mean, and I
to
appreciate that, and I know that it's important. These are very important conversations to have, right?
yeah. And centering that joy, it's important because it can't just all be, needs to be, but it can't just all be detention centers and extrajudicial killings and things like that, because I don't know, I'm always trying to figure out that line, or that line, right? That border, there's a border.
Right.
But that balance between awareness and hoping to spread that awareness, but then also just remembering how much life is actually here and how much beauty is actually here, in El Paso, but of course all the way here to Tucson and beyond to Tijuana
Oh yeah.
and so forth. But yeah, it's so fabulous how you worked through so much of that. And I'm wondering, if you're amenable here,
Yeah.
if you'll share with us an excerpt or two from the Border Simulator.
Yeah, sure. Let's see. Okay. I'll do I'll do two here, and just in our conversation, I kind of changed the
Oh,
second one. I'm going to read because I felt inspired to read a different poem for the second one. But here's two shorter poems
mm,
from the book The Border Simulator. This one is called "You Look at the Crossers, You Look Just Like Them." The Border Simulator is constant practice at Rossing, shopping at Ross. What to say when crossing? Am I right? And Ross Loss Prevention is always side-eyeing you, the merchandise. You might steal a badly seamed pair of bedazzled jeans, but Ross Loss Prevention cares more about you stealing yourself. Borders accept crossers as payment now. The cryptocurrency of the border is the crosser, and they are in crypt-like boxes as they cross. And soon they are released back from the crypt. If customs knows the crosser, they can't check their papers. But it's hard not to know everyone in this narrow corridor where corridos tuba from every car. It's so loud that it's quiet. You also don't get old. You just give up on the bridge, waiting next to the same daewoo for hours, and you roll down your window and start swapping stories about other wait times. On the Mexican side, customs had enough of the line and shouted to all the cars waiting, "Bocina, si no existes," honk if you don't exist. And all the cars honked. You couldn't even hear your passenger. And then,
Thank you.
oh yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for having me, Taylor. It's really an honor to get to speak with you, and also someone who's given such great thought to the book. So this last poem I'll read. It's the last poem of the book. It's called "You've Always Been a Border Simulator." You've always been a border simulator, resident, never real or simulated, and the crossers see that you're not real or simulated, and they're not sure if they are a mural of rural crossers. You simulate what a person with papers would say, would act like, so that you can cross over. Your accent is hard to understand. You have trouble saying your name, and you say it anyway. Customs are suspicious because you can't say your name, so they take you in and make you paint murals of crossers at the border. The murals warn crossers of what might be waiting for them, the unswerving future, an 8-bit desert. All day you paint in the border simulator portraits of crossers, and their portrait is their face covered by a phone. You paint murals of crossers going into the simulation, their faces also covered by their phones, but you can see their eyes, and they're scared of crossing. You ask them to pretend there is water. They can only pretend there is water so long. After your service to the simulator, you practice traversing your words, or the simulation traverses you. This simulation isn't a question of fake or reality, but a performance of saying your name. If the simulation survives, you also survive, and you keep it alive by crossing. The simulation exists because you cross into it, and you love the threshold. When you speak of the border simulator, you're really speaking about blank, how a $sign can open up a whole new world of crossing. You go to the front of the line, customs asks you less questions. In simulation, you can pay off la policía. It's harder to do that in reality. But it's not the result you want, and the simulation is a results-based game. When you speak of the border simulator, you're really speaking about the X, where the two worlds meet.
Gabriel, thank you so much for your time, for these readings today. I'm just indebted, to the labor behind this text, and I look forward to teaching it, to reading it again and again, because like I said, it was like, oh, I was so excited the first time through. It's so immensely formative to my understanding of the Southwest, and I do think that it'll find a firm place in the canon of these other works, Southwest literatures, and I'm certain I'll work through the pages again and again. But just a reminder to everyone here that the Border Simulator is available this August. We're so excited. We'll provide links and show notes for where to purchase it, and hopefully there will be readings in town and things of that nature forthcoming. But thank you so much, Gabriel.
Taylor, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure getting to talk to you about the book.
Thank you so much.